All right. Hi, everybody. So if you are here for the New York Media Meetup, you are in the right place. We're just going to give folks a couple seconds since I know I let everybody in just now, so folks are still kind of trickling in. So as we do that, we are joined obviously by our fantastic panelists, Alex, Rebecca, Catherine, and I want to make sure that we first kind of introduce the meetup, introduce myself, get through a few housekeeping items before we get into the discussion, but I promise we will do that very, very quickly. So first thing, there will be a Q&A portion at the end of the panel. So if you have questions, there should be a means within Zoom by which you can ask those questions. So there should be a Q&A button basically at the bottom of your screen. So just use that. I promise we will get to as many as we can when the last quarter of the hour comes by. And then also want to introduce myself. So I think there should be a lot of new folks in the audience. So I am JJ Kaleo. I founded the New York Media Meetup way back in 2014. My real job is I run a PR firm called Haymaker Group here in New York. We work primarily with tech companies, some of which you may have heard of, like Eventbrite or HubSpot and SoftBank Robotics, many others that you probably haven't, but are doing incredible things, and I hope you hear about them soon. We are a team of 16, so we are always looking for great folks to join us. If you are an incredibly talented PR person, please don't hesitate to reach out. We would always love to talk to you. And just a bit of context. So I actually began my media career as a reporter at Forbes. I overlapped with Alex a little bit and covered startups and venture capital and technology there. So I have some experience in media and obviously, still work within that industry, but on the PR side these days. And if you like what you see in terms of this panel, there will be many others. We organize these at least every quarter, always dedicated to the business or the craft of journalism. So please come back, please send us suggestions and we will try to get to them as well. And one last note before we get into the panel, we are actually doing another panel in December with reporters from Barron's and New York Times and Tom's Guide as well. And that will be dedicated to the insanity that is the CES, the Consumer Electronics Show. So if any of you are involved with that, please just, I'm sorry, I'm getting a notification about, wow, that's very bad. Give me 1 second and I will try and fix some of the issues that we're having on the Zoom right now. We are going to turn this off and that will hopefully prevent anything happening going forward. Really apologize about that. That has never happened before. So hopefully that is fixed now and will not happen again. But we will move on. So I'm going to first introduce the panelists here. So first, Alex Knapp, senior editor at Forbes, who covers healthcare, science, and cutting edge tech. Over there, he oversees their current climate newsletter as well, which brings readers the latest news in sustainability every Saturday. And he is based in Kansas City. Fun fact about Alex, has both a law degree and a degree in biochemistry, which is a deadly combo. Next up is Rebecca Lieber. So she is the senior reporter covering climate change at Vox, also serves on the board of the Society of Environmental Journalists, and previously worked at Mother at the New Republic, at Think Progress, and some recent articles by Rebecca include coverage on natural gas prices, midterm elections and their impact on the US climate agenda, and also some of the finer points around electrifying homes. And then we also have Catherine Boudreau, who is a senior sustainability reporter at Insider. She previously worked as a sustainability, excuse the mouthful there, a sustainability reporter at Politico, Also as a food and agriculture reporter there, and at Bloomberg BNA as well. Recent coverage by Catherine includes articles on COP27, on Nike's climate goals, and on lab-grown meat as well. So we will get into it. Really apologize about some of what's going on in the Q&A. I thought I had dismissed that, but I will try and figure that out as we get through. But let's move on in the meantime. So first, want to start basically with talking about how you all view sustainability as a beat and how you kind of define it. So Alex, I know you have maybe a more wide-ranging beat and purview than some of the other folks on this panel, but would love to hear about kind of what a story looks like for you, and then maybe we can go around the horn as well.
Sure. So just thinking of, Forbes is a business publication. Obviously, the biggest lens that we look at sustainability and climate change is through business. And my own personal philosophy on sustainability reporting, I'd report on climate change for a long time, but a couple of years ago, I did a Star Trek podcast. And I threw away a line. Someone asked me on the podcast before we kind of got going and said, well, are we ever going to fix climate change? And my offhand response was, as soon as we start making more money off of fixing it than causing it, we'll fix climate change. And that's kind of been like my lodestone, and the kind of stories that interest me is who's working on the solutions for climate change, and how do we, and where are people, making money in a way that is actually, doing more good than harm. And those are the kinds of stories that I'm really kind of interested in. I think it's important to talk about the challenges and the things that companies are doing wrong, obviously, but there's a lot of that. And so I'm kind of interested in where are the solutions, and where are the solutions that actually are, economically feasible, which is often a big hurdle to jump for some of these things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So really looking for kind of constructive, solution-based stories to tell the audience about. Does that align with how you view stories, Rebecca?
Yeah, I think covering solutions is a really important role in climate journalism. I know there's a lot of appetite for more of that. The way I view my beat, because you're right by saying that climate change and climate change alone is a very broad topic. And then if you're talking about sustainability, I think there's even other things that don't fall under a climate bucket, strictly speaking, like our biodiversity crisis and some other examples. So I've covered a really wide range of climate stories. I think the parts of the beat that I gravitate towards tend to be money in politics kinds of pieces, follow the money, like corporate influence. And I think like lately, the way I would probably define my beat is like looking at all the ways that fossil fuels are embedded in our lives, not just individually, but culturally, economically, and politically. So I think when we're talking about climate action, we're talking about changing a status quo, and the status quo is fossil fuels. So moving to the solutions that Alex covers takes money, it takes political will, and there are lots of obstacles that are purposely placed in the way to make that transition even harder. So I like to take apart what are those obstacles, why are they there, and who is putting them up. So I cover climate at Vox. I've covered the same beat for other outlets like Mother Jones and Grist. And I think the story keeps changing. I think if like I were to talk about this a few years ago, I would have given a very different answer about what I thought were the pressing issues on this beat. But I think as we move along the timeline we have left to take action take action on rising carbon emissions, I think the story is increasingly of urgency. It's one about not just what are the solutions, but how do we enact them before it's too late. So I'll stop talking there and let Catherine talk.
Thank you. No, it's great to hear about how you guys are approaching this. I'll say that, like, you know, as JJ mentioned, my background was in like food and agriculture reporting at Politico before I came to Insider. Well, and then I covered sustainability. And then I came to Insider to cover sustainability. So, yeah, I would say like when I first started out covering it at Politico, you know, it was an entirely new beat, and I didn't really see a lot of reporters devoted to sustainability. And I was really wanting to move into more like environment and climate reporting. And I kind of saw it as a segue to do that. And of course, like Politico had a lot of people already covering energy and environment. So I kind of figured this was could be a niche for me. And really the approach at the time, it was like March 2020, was what the business industry community was doing, executives on sustainability, since it was such a buzzword at the time. And like Trump was still president, so Washington wasn't really doing that much on climate. So we were trying to figure out a way how to cover that story, but do it from the business lens. And like ESG became like huge. So I just used that as like a broad compass, but I will say that it's a little flimsy. Like it's huge. It's a huge area to cover. So to just be like, okay, I'm going to cover ESG, that could mean a million different things. But I ended up covering a lot about like the debate in C-suites over diversity, equity, and inclusion. I covered environmental justice issues. Like I just kind of found some gaps in the newsroom that I could cover. Also plastic pollution and its connection to oil, and how this is like a big investment by the fossil fuel industry and plastics. That was a story I was covering. And then fast forward to my time at Insider. I've only been here for 6 months, but I was really hired to expand, I think, sustainability, but as I've gotten into it, it's really become like a climate solutions, climate geopolitics beat, just based on what I've been covering over the last 6 months, because I was at COP and Climate Week. And I've also just been trying to find like the gee whiz angle, I guess you could say, to some of the climate solutions, whether it's lab grown meat, which I tasted in Egypt, tastes like chicken. And I also like I've been covering a little bit about, you know, satellites that can detect methane emissions, which is like a huge new area of innovation, I think. So yeah, it's definitely always evolving, and it's just kind of, yeah, it's just always fluctuating, I would say, the beat.
How do you think about your audience, Catherine? Is there sort of a view that you have of the average reader that you're speaking to when you write some of these stories?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm still learning about the audience. Of course, we have a window into all like our traffic, for example. I've never had that before at any other outlet. Of course, I've only ever worked at Politico and Bloomberg BNA before this, but you know, we just have access to all of that at our fingertips, which is really cool. But I'll say that, you know, the stories that tend to get the most traffic, I would say, and the resonate most are like solutions reporting, or like I was talking about, just the new innovations, the new tech that's aimed at solving the climate crisis. But also just kind of explaining how even like climate policy impacts your everyday life. And then certainly like finance stories, like where the money is going, and, you know, like those stories get pretty good pickup. So I would imagine I'm told our audience skews younger, but I don't know. It's hard to know exactly who the audience is, but I would say like kind of like, you know, young people interested in like how they can invest their money and how like the everyday, like, or politics will affect their everyday life. And yeah, but I'm still learning.
That makes sense. So maybe sort of a younger, curious reader who's interested in figuring out how to integrate sustainable habits into their lives, or where to put their money, or what to work on, that sort of thing. Rebecca, I'm very familiar with Vox's reporting and style, and it's often very policy oriented and very much about kind of untangling the complications of legislation or how power works in DC or at the state level, or within finance, whatever it might be. How do you think about your audience? Is it more of a decision maker, policy maker audience? Is it somewhere in between kind of Catherine's and what I just described?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it can be a mix. I think generally when I'm reporting, I think the audience I'm thinking about the most are people who might care about climate change. They certainly would list it as a concern. It's not that they are a climate denier and I'm trying to convince them otherwise. But maybe they aren't following every in and out of climate policy debates. So I view my job as clarifying for a pretty wide general readership what are the biggest stakes and what complicated policy fights are about. And like I said before, all the other kinds of lens I take to these stories. So yeah, I think it's that audience can potentially skew younger. I think it can be a very diverse audience. I've years ago, I think we're in such a world of polarized echo chambers that I just don't see a purpose of if you are a climate denier at this point, reading the Upteam article about climate science will not convince you otherwise. So that is not something I'm considering in readership. I think it's interesting how that can tie in with how to influence decision makers and have impact on policy, which is certainly a goal. I think some of the areas I've found the most resonance there, I think when there are stories particularly about corruption, those can really hit at that, where you are drawing an audience of hopefully people in charge who can do something about it in terms of oversight. I think the stories I personally I've done a lot more, I think, and there's a lot to do on the intersection of consumerism and climate. And I don't mean that as a we should all be riding bicycles kind of point, but an area of reporting I've done a lot more on the last few years is around gas appliances in our homes and how that affects our indoor air quality, our public health, and also climate change, because this is connected to our vast gas infrastructure and supply chain. So I think by placing people, by literally talking about the gas stove in your home and then extrapolating, going wider of what is that gas stove connected to, I think a lot of people don't make those connections, and they may feel disconnected from why is this policy over there about whether to build another LNG terminal? How could that possibly have anything to do with my heating bill? It does relate. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to really shift people's thinking and surprise them on this beat in ways we might not realize. We can be surprised that there are these interconnections in every part of our lives. So yeah, that was a long answer to what kind of audience I'm going after, but I think my goal is really I want people to learn something new from my reporting, and occasionally be surprised. I think climate change can feel it's just this. It's not, but that it's a one-note catastrophe, and I think that there's so many layers to this beat, and ways to kind of resonate with people on this emotional way as well.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Alex, I'm certainly familiar with kind of the Forbes audience as traditionally understood. but I feel like even since I've left, it's really changed and expanded in a lot of ways. So I'd be curious to hear about how you think about your audience as well.
Sure, it's a broad mix, and obviously the traditional audience is still very strong, which is people in the C-suites and upper management, venture capitalists, investors. But definitely in the last few years, we've also skewed younger people at the closer beginning of their careers who are wanting to invest, people who are getting into their late 30s, early 40s, who are really just thinking about ways to do entrepreneurship and things like that. As I like, maybe I shouldn't say this the day after we publish our under 30 list, but most people become entrepreneurs in their 40s. So, and there's a lot of interest in being an entrepreneur in the sustainable space. So being able to talk about these things is interesting. And I also like to surprise people. To Rebecca's point, like like I live in Kansas. We are the state that produces the second most. In terms of percentage of our electricity, we're second in renewable energy, only to California. So like you wouldn't think about that, but that's because of all the wind farms and things like that, which have also been a boon to a lot of farmers in the area who might have some acreage that they need to lay fallow or they can't use for whatever reason. They can lease it out to, they can lease out about 80 acres and put a wind turbine on it, and it's a source of income. And there's a lot of interesting things like that I think people don't know and would find interesting.
I certainly did not know that and would not have expected that. So Alex, we're going to stick with you for this one, if you don't mind, which is want to understand how coverage of this beat and sort of the resources that have been invested in that coverage have changed in recent years. Because I think, Rebecca, you sort of alluded to this, a lot has happened in terms of climate in the past 5 years. I think on one level, we've seen that it's happening currently, the impacts on the weather and on society and all of that. It is a present day problem. I think on the other hand, we've seen policy solutions move forward in some ways more quickly than expected. On the international level, maybe not as quickly as expected. But on the media side, it also feels like there's real investment in terms of this kind of coverage. I think the discussion that we would have had in 2014 and it would have looked very different than it would today. So all of that said, Alex, curious about how Forbes has thought about coverage of this topic and how that has evolved in recent years.
Yeah, I think that there's two big things that have happened in the last probably half decade that have really started to change people's minds about how they think about climate. And one is that a lot of the impacts of climate change are really starting to become undeniable. I mentioned farmers. Like we had an agricultural technology summit a couple of years ago where I did a panel on weather patterns changing as a result of climate change. So in the Midwest, it's starting to rain a lot more in the spring and fall, but a lot less in the summer, which impacts the kinds of crops you want to grow and things like that. The farmers all know this because they track all of this, and you can't deny the data. So I think that's one of them. And disasters too, wildfires and the increase in, how many 100 years floods have they had in Houston in the last 5 years? It's several. And so I think that the impacts becoming undeniable are kind of driving a real hunger for what do we do next. And then the other thing is that we're finally starting to see a lot of the technology mature. There are affordable electric cars out there. I've already got my eye on an EUV if I can finally find a dealer that has one, a Bolt EUV. I want to get that. And a lot of these things are becoming more affordable, more economically feasible. I mean, when I was growing up as a child in the 80s, nuclear fusion was 20 years away, and it's been 20 years away for as long as I can remember. But I say it's now people are saying it's 10 years away. So, they're making real progress. I think the maturation of a lot of the technologies and just the sheer cost of solar and wind dropping so much I think has made an impact, and kind of related a confluence of both of those things. Having talked to a lot of business folks the last year or so, the war in Ukraine and seeing how delicate energy supplies are, there's a real kind of hunger to be more self-sufficient in energy, and renewable energy is like the main way to do that.
So Alex, my understanding is that the sustainability basically newsletter that you work on, relatively recent. And
Yeah.
and what have other hires and efforts in that realm look like in recent years? Like, how many dedicated kind of climate reporters are there at Forbes, or however you all define it?
Sure, I'd say it's a little bit more of a horizontal than a vertical at Forbes. So
Yeah.
a lot of me and my colleagues, I write sustainability stories from my kind of viewpoint. We have reporters who write about electric vehicles. Our food and drink editor does a lot on sustainability and things like that. So it's really kind of horizontal across the newsroom rather than being a more kind of dedicated vertical of its own. Of course, we have freelancers who contribute at Forbes, and they talk about sustainability, and a lot of the stories I look at and kind of talk about in the newsletter come from that. But the newsletter is relatively new, but the interest for it's been very hungry. I think we started it maybe late. I'd have to go check, but it's maybe a year or so old, if that. And it's grown to nearly 50,000 subscribers pretty organically. We haven't really done a big marketing push for it or anything. But so people are definitely interested. And when we started tweaking it to actually include more of the business aspects and the dollars and cents moving around, it actually peaked, the audience jumped more when we started doing that stuff.
Yeah, that's great. Catherine, we're going to jump over to you. I know you haven't been at Business Insider all that long, but it would be interesting to hear your sense of how the treatment of this beat has evolved within that organization. And also if you have any sense of how that may be played out at Politico as well, since maybe you have a, kind of longer time horizon there, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So when I can start from the beginning at Politico, since I was like a new beat there. And basically it just started with an editor and myself. And we were doing like a once a week newsletter and doing enterprise on the side. And then it expanded to more team members, a deputy editor, and like they are covering, and then I think it's like every day, at least almost every day now, the long game newsletter, that is like the main kind of like focal point of their coverage. So that's certainly grown. And then at Insider, it's me and my editor, and potentially maybe they'll be expanding the team a little bit more, but like to be determined. So I think at Insider, it's like a priority, but I'm still a little bit on an island, but I do, similar to what Alex was saying about being a horizontal, like there's reporters covering transportation, technology, finance. So I partner with them to cover sustainability stories or a climate story as much as possible. Also the science desk, there's a reporter on the science desk who does a lot of climate science coverage. So we'll team up sometimes. So it's really, it's like me and then collaborating across the newsroom as much as possible. But I think that I've been told it's an area of growth for the company. So
it makes sense. And Rebecca, you have been on this beat for a long time at a lot of different organizations. So if you have a sense about how those organizations have treated the beat and how that has changed, we'd love to hear that. But even just your view of how it's different, today versus when you first began in terms of the industry overall, in terms of your perch at the Society of Environmental Journalists. It'd be interesting to hear that perspective as well.
Yeah. So I was beginning on the climate beat. It was like around the 2011 era. In fact, that was like Keystone XL was kind of like heating up at the time as a political issue. And I was kind of coming into the space at a time that all the large newspapers had laid off a fair portion of their environmental desks because Congress, not more complicated than that, there was a recession, but Congress failed to pass a cap and trade bill. And I think a lot of outlets took a cue that, okay, this issue's over. We aren't going to cover climate to the extent that we were. A lot of these desks got a lot smaller. The good news is since then, I think there's been a huge growth period, especially I'd say like kind of starting with the Trump administration, where places have been recognizing that this is the present, this is the future of journalism. And now I saw the Washington Post bragging about how it now has, I think, like a 30-person team on this. The New York Times, I've lost track how big their team is. And I think you see that at a lot of outlets, like Vox does not have a 30-person team devoted to climate, but I think there has been some growth. We have someone, for example, particularly focused on biodiversity, and that is a new position in the last few years. So I think there's been staffing up, which is great. I think there are still, I guess, like looking back at those early days, the 2010s, I think, like, again, I was coming in at a time that a lot of reporters were still very much doing false equivalence on the science, quoting climate deniers as if they had equal arguments to climate scientists. I think there was more, maybe like deference to certain conservative and Republican arguments that were on the face of it kind of ridiculous. I remember an era of politicians saying, I'm not a scientist, so like, don't ask me about climate. I remember I used to beg like political reporters during presidential debates just to ask anything on climate, anything at all. I think the 2012 presidential election, we actually went the entire time without a single question on climate. So we've come a long way since then, which is good. I think what Alex was speaking to about this horizontal like nature across the newsroom is true in a lot of newsrooms. I see it at Vox, where people covering other beats finally see the intersections with climate. They're like, you can't cover the war in Ukraine without also covering this as a climate issue, or you can't cover immigration without thinking about the climate effects and climate refugees. So like, I think there's more recognition of some basic literacy for all reporters on this. So you're not working in a silo. I think there's also cues from like the business world, just like Alex was saying, and the government finally passing some funding for climate through the Inflation Reduction Act, that like this is something to cover. I wish like I think there's I guess like I think there's still a lot of work to do basically on this in media. I think sadly, like a thing that, for example, like media networks, TV networks continue to say, I've never worked in TV, but I've heard that like climate change just doesn't get views. So it's hard to give this primetime coverage because it's not getting the same attention as like talking heads fighting on the network. And like, I think that's a big reason why we still don't see enough coverage on TV. And I think like the same can happen for other kinds of outlets, including ones I've worked at, that like, unfortunately, these are also business decisions. So my argument is, if you care about this issue, like to be vocal and support places that are investing in that coverage. I think, and sorry, I will just briefly talk about my other role, which is board of directors at Society of Environmental Journalists, which is the country's largest membership association of reporters covering issues like sustainability and climate. And in that role, I started this year, but there's also lots of nonprofits, including SEJ, that are supporting this kind of work. They are they have grants, for example, and fellowships that are designed to support coverage of issues that might not get enough media investment otherwise. So that's just another way to support this level of coverage by looking for nonprofits. I think SCJ is a great example, where you can make a tax deduction, tax deductible donation to support this kind of journalism.
So I'm going to plug SCJ. Folks, if you're watching this, you should probably think about making a tax deductible donation. I'm sure it's easily Googleable. And sorry if I interrupted you, Catherine. I saw you came off mute.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention something too, just about the evolution of coverage, which I think is a good sign, and just in terms of like it getting more sophisticated. Because like when I first started, you know, we might cover here and there, like when a company set a goal, and that like doesn't really exist as much anymore. And I think that's a good thing, because like, cool, you set a goal, like it's no longer it's no longer news if a company is like, I'm going to set a net zero goal. We've moved to the phase where we're like, well, what the heck does that even mean? You know, like, how are you actually going to get there? And is it the solutions that you're employing like real, or are they false? Like, I think this whole like coverage of carbon offsets, for example, has gotten a lot better. And I was trying to wrap my hand around it, you know, 2 years ago. And now we're getting to a point where we can say, okay, like, what is actually a quality carbon offset? What does that actually mean? And even like standard setters are still like trying to figure that out. So I think the sophistication of covering businesses and their promises is getting better, which is a good thing.
Yeah, just to give a quick perspective on that from the other side. So we worked with Etsy in terms of coverage around their goals and their carbon offsets. And they were ahead of the curve in terms of e-commerce companies and that sort of thing. But this was probably 2019. If we were to do that today, I think the coverage and the attention that we would have gotten, or that we would get, would be a fraction. You know, so I can totally tell that the appetite for those sorts of stories is definitely changed, which seems like a good thing, which seems like at least some progress. Just to switch gears for a minute, I'm curious about who you are most excited to speak to. You know, so somebody lands in your inbox, you immediately want to get on the phone with them, and you know, maybe you're very likely to leave that conversation excited, much more informed than you had been before, et cetera. And then there are probably other versions of this. Folks who land in your inbox who you're not all that excited to speak to. Maybe there are good reasons to speak to them, maybe not, but maybe you're more likely to ignore them. So basically, what is a good source for you? Who is helpful? Who is not helpful? And Alex, we'll start with you if that's okay.
Sure. So I guess I've gotten the tip to a couple of the more, I think, interesting sustainability companies I've gotten from self-interested sources, that being the VCs who invest in them. But they tend to get excited. I found that investors tend to get really excited about the companies that are actually have like a feasible product. And those are the companies I like to write about, was the ones that are not looking on a 10-year time scale to make money, but are like making money today or have a cost competitive solution. And I usually get tipped off to those by VCs and investors. Occasionally, and then also colleges and academics for going back a little bit further in some of the more kind of innovative discoveries. But those are usually the ones that are more interesting. I find that the larger public companies tend to not, you know, it's funny with the public companies. I don't know if Rebecca or Catherine had this experience. The things they're doing that are more interesting, they don't want to talk about, and the things that are more like boring or meaningless are the ones that they're really that they're really getting excited about, which is just fascinating to me personally. But
any examples of that, Alex?
Well, I mean, you know, Coca-Cola, well, no, I mean, that's a bad example, but I won't name a company by name, but you'll have a company that will make a big to-do about some big kind of very visible sustainability thing that they're doing. Um, and then you dive into their books or their earnings reports or whatever, and you find, what is this cost offset? Like, they figured out that they could, save 10 million on the bottom line this quarter by turning off the lights at night, which maybe they didn't do last quarter. I mean, it's just really silly things like that. These really practical things that are actually more effective than the whatever big kind of thing that they're promoting. And I always find that kind of fascinating. So
That's funny. So kind of the boring, X's and O's stuff can make a big impact if you're a massive, international conglomerate. Like, just turn the
yeah,
lights off.
I mean, if you have 1,000 data centers and you can shave 2% off of your energy consumption, then you will probably have saved several $1 million that quarter. So
Yeah. So that's good. Rebecca, how about you?
Yeah, to give like some other ideas. Well, I like talking to scientists, because like particularly like if you could find there's a lot of people working in academia who like don't realize that they're sitting on some like amazing story. And I think like generally for sources, I love talking to people who are just like fully focused on one thing and obsessed with it. And I think that spans more than scientists, but I guess like with scientists, just I think it's like not only just like a climate change story, but there's people like, for example, studying how to like measure air quality, who talk about how like just where we place the sensors can wildly change results we get, and it can affect whether frontline communities near like a coal plant or petrochemical plant it's actually registering that it's as polluted as they think. So like there's like interesting policy connections too. Other types of sources, like I really love like the like knowledgeable community activists, again, who's like obsessed with something, who to give an example, like people, I've been doing a lot of stories on electrification of buildings and how to get them off gas. And a lot of this fight is happening at the local level. And like I'll hear from people, the groups that are working on the ground about this, that they're going to this very small local city council meeting, and like the gas lobby will show up with like 12 of their top lawyers at this like tiny meeting. So you can hear wild stories that way that like national press generally are not paying attention to. I think like I've been trying to reach out more to sources also who work like kind of adjacent to climate. So more people, like, for example, I did a story recently on contractors and the issue around installing heat pumps, that a lot of contractors just aren't familiar with the technology. So that story kind of came out of talking to people in this space. Like I think same with people who work in medicine who want more climate awareness and environmental pollution awareness in their fields, but are struggling to get that attention. So few examples.
Awesome. How about you, Catherine?
Yeah, I think I'm just thinking about back to the sources I've most recently been talking to, especially like while covering COP27, for example. Like I talked to people on two different sides of the spectrum. There was the main CEO of EQT, which is the big, natural gas company, and hearing him talk about how they're pushing natural gas as a green fuel compared to coal and how they want to export it around the world. He was just so like, he was just trying so hard to persuade us that this is like the climate solution of the future, natural gas. And hearing his perspective, and then talking to, like, juxtaposing that with the activists from many different African countries about, like, hey, like, why are we doing all these gas deals to feed Europe's hunger for more natural gas when we could, like, go towards renewable energy, which is cheaper, and we don't have to lock it in all this new infrastructure. It's just, obviously you want to talk to a range of different sources, but just that enormous, like, gulf really just was it was just crazy, honestly, to be there hearing these two different narratives. And then I would say also just I got the opportunity to just talk to, similar to what Rebecca was saying about, like, the community activists, like talking to the indigenous leaders from Brazil about what their hopes are for, the incoming president Lula, and just what's happening in, like, the Amazon. It's just, I think it's just gonna have a diverse range of perspectives all the time, which is a pretty generic advice, I guess. But those are just some of the recent sources that have really opened my eyes.
Is there anybody who you all don't want to talk to?
I get a lot of company product pitches that I don't care about. And yeah, I mean, I know, like, lots of journalists have their spiel about PR, certain PR tactics, but yeah, like, it's wild what I'm not usually doing a glowing profile of your company, and, like, I get a lot of just, like, talk about how great we are, again, for, like, yeah, what Catherine was talking about, like, some goal that's not that interesting. And I think one area that, like, I got a tip years ago that actually, like, I think is more interesting than I gave it credit for is I never cover awards for awards' sake. Like, I'm not going to say that someone got an award, but those can actually be useful for figuring out both sourcing and ideas for stories, especially, like, if there's this cool, like, this grant for, like, this like, solution that can actually make a big splash in a certain field. Like, I think those kinds of awards can actually be, like, more helpful than I used to give them credit for as story ideas.
Catherine,
Yeah.
were you going to chime in?
Yeah, I was just going to echo. I'm very skeptical of any company that's marketing their product as sustainable, because it's so nuanced. Okay, so for instance, my husband came home and was like, my sneaker is made of recycled plastic. And I was just extremely skeptical. I'm like, I don't know. I'd have to double check that if that's true. I don't know. I'm especially in fashion. I just have maybe, like, looked into, like, doing a story on Nike, for example, where, they have, I would say, they're doing a lot of work to promote themselves as sustainable, but then they're very transparent in their ESG report. Like, they've shifted so much manufacturing to Vietnam, which is a coal dominated power grid. So you just have to, like, if you just go behind, like, the books, if a company's transparent enough, you can see that, like, okay, maybe the sneaker is made out of recycled plastic, but I mean, how much of a difference is that making in the grand scheme of things? So certainly the product pitches are tough, and it just requires a lot more vetting. And I'm not always sure that that's, like, the best use of my time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I read that piece, and very unfortunate, the enduring demand for leather sneakers, apparently, in terms of the sustainability of that item. So we are past 5:45. I do want to make sure that we get to some of the answers the questions that the audience put in the chat. So we'll go through some of those quickly. I have one last question that I think I want to end on. But this first one here is from Peter Himmler. So he is asking about how you all either do or do not separate climate reporting from energy or utility reporting, which is interesting, because I think that probably would have been very separate a decade ago, certainly, maybe not as separate now, and could vary among your organizations. But Alex, why don't we start with you? and Chris Hellman comes to mind as sort of the main Forbes energy reporter who I remember well. So curious about how you all think about it in terms of that separation.
Yeah, I mean, we don't really separate it. So, Chris, I mean, as you know, our energy reporter and who kind of with the colleagues that he works with, he's very knowledgeable about the oil and gas industry. He's based in Houston, but he's done a lot of writing about sustainable, renewable energy topics, and he brings a very jaundiced eye to it, which I think is great. I mean, he did a really great piece a couple of years ago about an offshore wind project that was really just a boondoggle. Like they weren't going to get their money back. They were, trying to get more taxpayer subsidies to support it. It really wasn't a very environmentally friendly project. They were trying to sell it as one, but it really wasn't. And but I think part of his ability to kind of do that story was the fact that he was experienced in like traditional energy production and had traditional sourcing, not just kind of the sourcing in the renewable and sustainable stage. And I think it's a real asset to kind of have that kind of deep expertise. So, I think if you're reporting on energy production, you got to be knowledgeable about all aspects of it, from renewables to batteries to, burning coal. So.
Yeah. Catherine and Rebecca, how about you?
I would say that our energy coverage is very markets focused, kind of like the ups and downs of the energy market. But I also have, seen great work from some of the reporters too, just about, for example, the war in Ukraine and the tension between, doing more natural gas or expanding into renewables, and the calls for windfall taxes, for example, on energy companies that are profiting off of this. So I would say that it's there's maybe not as much overlap as there should be with sustainability and energy at the moment at Insider.
Yeah, I just reiterate that I do think it's there's more overlap than there used to be. I remember a time when people would be very strict about, no, I cover energy only. And like I now see the Wall Street Journal, like those lines where they're strictly energy stories are also talking about climate, because that's what the business community is talking about too. Right. So I do think there's more intersection there. And I would argue, I don't think there should be a distinction.
Yeah, that makes sense. Next question comes from Lisa Kovitz, who asks about solutions-oriented stories, which we kind of began the panel with. And she's asking what's sort of the threshold for those to be interesting. So examples that she throws out: upcycling clothing, curbside compost pickup, buy nothing groups, regenerative farming. I don't know. We've talked about a lot of those kinds of things maybe for a while, but how flashy does it need to be interesting? How impactful, I think is what Lisa's going for. Alex, maybe we go back to you, if that's okay.
Sure. I mean, really the kind of thing I look for in this type of story is cost competitiveness, or at least the ability to become cost competitive. So if you're like, there's a company I did a story on a couple of years ago that was building kind of a material for a better lithium ion battery. And the thing that I thought was really attractive about their business model is they had a better material that could just drop into the current manufacturing process. Didn't require new capital expenditures, didn't require new things. That to me is like sustainable, because you're offering something which is better battery capacity, but you're not asking people to make a huge infrastructure spend in order to do it. And it's that type of thing where you're either profitable now or you can be once you start scaling. It's the ones that where, well, we've got this great thing and it works in the prototype, but like this prototype, lab grown steak costs us $1 million to grow. It's like that's great that you can do that. Call me when you can, do it for $10 a pound, like I buy it at the grocery store.
So it has to be, sort of likely to have a short-term impact, essentially.
I think, I mean, especially because stretched pretty thin. That's what's interesting. Like, if it's feasible now, or can be, like maybe some things require scale to be cost competitive, and that's fine. But like, there's got to be some kind of path to economic feasibility.
Yeah.
That some of these solutions you see, they're super cool, and I like talking to scientists about. We made this polymer that can desalinate a liter of water in an hour without any energy input. But it also takes us like 9 months to make the polymer. That's, that might not be the best solution. This I love hearing about it, but like some of the things I think maturation, especially in this business climate right now, I think is really what's important to my beat personally.
Yeah, some practicality, some maturation. Rebecca and Catherine, how about you?
I'd agree on, I think like something that I guess I approach it a little less from like cost competitiveness, but solutions that can be scaled. So getting out of that, like, what can you do, like ride a bike or do composting, but like networks of people and political action, and like how to scale this up to like where we actually see like entire cities, states actually implementing these policies. I think like this ties back to what we were talking about earlier, but like generally when it comes to like solution stories, I'm personally very skeptical of anything that's like promoting consumerism as like more consumerism as a solution to consumerism, which is essentially the problem. So like buy this brand so to solve our plastics problem isn't like so I guess those are two things I'm looking for on those stories.
Yeah, I'd echo, both of what Alex and Rebecca said. And also, I mean, because there's just vast amounts of solutions you could potentially, explore. I think focusing on the industries that need to be decarbonized to actually make a big difference is important. So like focusing on transportation or, energy, agriculture, like I think those are really the big pots of emissions. So it's like, does the solution have a potential to make a big dent in those emissions, for example? Like that would be where a good focus is. And I just have a question for Alex though, too, because like when you say, how is it going to be, cost competitive? Like, what do you look for to actually make that determination? And is it scalable? And like, if it's not scalable within X time frame, are you just like, whatever? Just curious.
I mean, part of it's a judgment call. Part of it's just talking with, kind of outside experts on it. And I mean, sometimes, if the really good companies will show me a price sheet and be like, look, the one that's oil-based sells for X dollars a gallon and we sell it for X dollars and 10 cents a gallon. Okay, that's cost competitive. And actually I have a story with a sustainable company where they can undersell the fossil-based model. They're not, because they want to make more money, but they could if they really wanted to corner the market. So, and I thought that was cool that they're doing something in a much more sustainable way that's not involving cracking crude oil. So
Okay, lightning round. I'm gonna skip a crypto question. I apologize, Tim, but I've had too much crypto news in my feed lately. So we're gonna go to Sarah. Real quick, how do you feel about climate research? Do you like interesting studies and research reports? Let's just do a yes or no, because I want to end on a different question. Catherine, we'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I love climate research, and so like scientists are some of the best people to talk to. They're just experts, and often they don't know like a story is a story. So they'll just give like, that's not always the case, but sometimes I've just found that they're like, sitting on something that they didn't realize was really, a big change. So yes, absolutely love climate research. I won't report on all of it, but it's a good way to build sources.
Rebecca?
Yeah. Yes.
Awesome. Alex?
yes.
Cool. 3 yeses. Probably good news for Sarah. All right, my last question, and then I do want to make sure we let you guys go because it's just about 6 p.m. What kind of world do you think we're looking at in 2040? Whoever wants to start.
Sure. I'll go first because I'm not the most optimistic, so someone can end on a higher note. I think we are in for a lot of instability because of inaction, and I think I still believe the world will get its act together eventually. And the sad and, like, I guess, exciting thing at the same time is I feel in my lifetime I will know if we have succeeded or failed on climate. I don't think it gets real bad necessarily around 2040, but I think by mid-century it certainly does. And yeah, I do hope we think lots of things happen and both political parties wake up and that we make more aggressive steps.
Yeah, I feel like there's days that I'm like, we got this. And then the next day it's just like blown into pieces. And I think that's because, like, there's some things that make me optimistic, which is like, the cost of renewable energy has dropped a lot. It's like now the cheapest, like solar is like the cheapest form of new infrastructure, new energy. So that's exciting, but also there's just enormous barriers to getting it deployed. Especially like in developing countries that what seems like are ready to go like more in on like natural gas, for example. So that's alarming. But then at the same time too, like I reflected a lot at COP, where were we like in 2016 when the Paris Agreement was signed? And I think the world was on track to warm to like 4 degrees by the end of the century and like above pre-industrial levels. And now it's more like 2.7 or so, which is still bad and like catastrophic, but better than it was. I don't know how, I haven't written the story yet about why exactly that is. I don't know if it's because we've had COPs or because we got off coal in the US, or not entirely, but we're phasing that out or what. Like there's a multitude of reasons for that, but that makes me optimistic. But again, the pace is just really not fast enough at all. And you have to, I think, do like major big policy in other countries. US has to do more, like, yeah, China. It alarms me, like China, for example, too, like they just, the US and China relationship is in turmoil right now. I think that's the 2 biggest emitters. That's alarming. So it's a mixed bag.
Alex, a note of optimism?
I will give you, I think I share the pessimism on policy and policy inaction. I do, my note of optimism is that I do really think that a lot of market trends look good, like renewable energy is getting cheaper. In 2040, nobody's going to be building new coal plants. I think there will be more gas than we'd probably like, but there's going to be a lot of wind and solar. I do think that there will be a lot more cleaner cars on the road, but there'll still be gas, but a lot more cleaner cars on the road. Although I think for big trucks and stuff, I'm a little skeptical of electrification for big commercial and industrial shipping. I think hydrogen's more likely if there's a competitive green fuel at all. But I think a lot, and then there's just so many great advances in materials science that just make things easier to kind of incorporate sustainability in a cool way. And I'm very excited. Material science is a really overlooked area, and there's so many cool things coming out of it. And that's where a lot of the optimism comes from in terms of renewable energy and sustainability and things like that. But I'm a little pessimistic about policy, although by 2040, things will become so undeniable that you might at least get policy agreements to buy lots of direct air capture facilities. So that might be as bad as good as we get.
Climeworks. I have a monthly subscription. But thank you all for your time and for going 4 minutes over here. I know there's a lot that you all could be doing right now. So really appreciate how generous everybody was and really appreciate the insights. So I'm sure folks are giving you a big round of applause in kind of Zoom land, and look forward to reading all of your work. folks in the audience, please follow everybody on Twitter. I have linked their accounts in the meetup group, and continue to read their work. So Alex, Rebecca, Catherine, thank you all very much, and hope to talk again soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.